The detailed instruction manual included with the kit is going to be one of the most important things that you're going to reference to while building this helicopter. We thoroughly suggest you follow and read every part of this instruction manual before you do anything to this helicopter kit at all. Read all of the warranty, all of the warnings, read everything in this manual cover to cover to get a clear understanding of what it is you're going to be doing while assembling this helicopter. This manual, if used properly, will allow you to build your helicopter kit safely and will allow it to fly the way it was meant to fly. In step 1-1, on this side of the page in the manual, you will notice you need to locate these parts sitting in front of me. You need one mainframe, two motor mounts, two bearing blocks, one canopy standoff, one mainframe center brace, and 12 2x6mm socket cap screws. To do the assembly, you will use a 1.5mm hand driver and blue Loctite. As you start to do your assembly and you are going to apply Loctite to your screws, take your screws and put them in the driver like this. Apply a small amount of Loctite to the end of the screw until you've coated it all the way around, and it's basically wet. You want to be able to see the Loctite, but you don't want it dripping off of the screw. If you have too much Loctite, it'll make your model very difficult to get apart later on. If you have too little, it will be ineffective. Over time, Loctite can become less effective, and you need to check your screws for tightness and make sure that the Loctite is still effective. This will keep your model safe to fly, but make sure that it is doing its job. Any of the parts or any of the hardware that goes into plastic, such as the screws that go into this part right here, as you put this together, will not require Loctite because they are going into plastic. Plastic a lot of times can be attacked by certain types of Loctite, so it's usually a bad thing if you put Loctite on a screw going into plastic. Try to avoid doing that. Let's look at what this looks like all put together, and we'll see how detailed this build really is. After completing step 1-1 of the manual, if you followed where all of the screws go, where the canopy standoff goes, the face up, face down of the bearing blocks, and all the surfaces of the motor mounts, the raised surfaces facing down, you will get to the bottom, and this is exactly what you should basically have in your hand when you get done. Make sure you note that the upper and lower bearing blocks, the face of the bearings is facing up and down. Canopy standoff goes, of course, in the front. The motor mounts are flat on their surfaces. The raised surfaces are facing downward. Leave all the screws at this time. Go ahead and just leave those loose for right now, because what you're going to do is we're going to line the frames up later, so that won't apply to what you're doing right now, so go ahead and leave all the screws loose. Let's move on to step 1-2 and see what we got. In step 1-2 of the manual, on this side of the page in the manual, you will notice you need to locate one carbon battery tray and 4 2x4mm socket cap screws to complete this step. In this step, we do realize that some people will not want to use socket cap screws for this application because they believe they may do damage to their batteries. To address this, we included 4 2x4mm button head screws that are in the spare parts bag. They're going to be located in this section of the bag. To complete this step, you're going to use a 1.5mm handled driver and blue Loctite. You will be attaching this carbon tray to the front of the model right here, so you can go ahead and tighten it down. It has nothing to do with the frame alignment that we will do later in the manual. So let's look at what this all looks like put together. After completing step 1-2 of the manual, this is basically what you should have in your hand. As you can see, I went on ahead and used the 2x4mm socket cap screws. What I will usually do is I will take a piece of adhesive back Velcro. This piece right here came out of the helicopter kit. And I will usually just cover the screws up with the adhesive back Velcro. So they're covered with the Velcro. I've never had any issues with these doing any damage to any battery I've ever had, and I've been playing with these for quite a while now. So once you have your tray on, make sure it's secured nice and tight. You've used blue Loctite. You don't need to worry about leaving this loose because it's basically done at this point. So let's move on to step 1-3. In step 1-3 of the manual on this side of the page, you will notice you need to locate one anti-rotation base, the anti-rotation bracket, and 4 2x4mm socket cap screws. To complete the assembly, you will be using a 1.5mm handled driver and blue Loctite. What you're going to do is you're basically attaching this carbon plate to this aluminum piece. When you attach the carbon plate to the aluminum piece, all you're basically going to do is tighten it all the way down. Let's look at what this all looks like assembled and we'll get the details down. After completing step 1-3 of the manual, if you've paid close attention to the orientation of the parts and where they go, this is exactly what you should have in your hand. You will notice that the carbon plate is on the front of the aluminum piece towards the main bearing block. The two screws that attach this carbon plate to the aluminum should be tightened securely with the use of blue Loctite. The screws on the side, go ahead and leave those loose because we will use those to align the frames, which we'll get to here in just a short period of time. So let's get on to step 1-4. In step 1-4 of the manual on this side of the page, you'll notice you need to locate one main frame, one canopy standoff, 12 2x6mm socket cap screws, and two 2x4mm socket cap screws. The two 2x4mm socket cap screws go here to mount the anti-rotation bracket to the frame. All of the rest of them go in their locations as pointed out in the manual. If you notice these parts right here, you may wonder what they are. If you move forward to step 1-5+, you will notice these are the tail servo plates. We discovered that it's a little difficult to mount them in this particular part of the assembly. If you do it in step 1-4 before you mount the frame to the main frame assembly, it's much easier to do. So go ahead and mount those up and we'll get this put on. Don't tighten any of the screws down yet and we'll go over how to square up the frames here in just a second. To do this step, you're going to use a 1.5mm handle driver and blue Loctite. Be sure to not use Loctite on any of these screws going into this plastic piece right here. All of the rest of them will need a decent amount of Loctite applied to them as gone over earlier in the assembly steps. And let's put this together and see what it looks like. After completing step 1-4 of the manual, if you've paid close attention to where the hardware goes, you'll notice there are only two 2x4mm socket cap screws used in this part of the assembly. They go right here in the anti-rotation bracket. All the rest of the hardware in this assembly is 2x6mm. If you look right here, you will notice that I have moved forward in the manual to step 1-5+ and completed the steps where I'm mounting the tail servo brackets. This makes it much easier to do before you mount the frame to the assembly. Now we're going to move on to squaring up the frames. When you square up the frames, basically you're just going to set the model on a real nice flat surface and go across the hardware. You're going to tighten one screw and go across to the next screw, and then you're going to tighten that screw. Do this all over the entire helicopter until you get all of the screws tightened. Be sure not to over-tighten screws that are going into plastic parts. Also, the motor mount screws can be left loose at this time. The motor mount will be removed later to put the motor on and reinstall it into the helicopter. When tightening the canopy standoffs, they have been designed with a hole in them, right here. A 1.5mm handled driver fits through this hole perfectly so that you can actually tighten it down. Be sure you understand you have a lot of torque with this in your hand and you can very easily break this off. Usually what I will do is I'll snug it down by hand until it stops and then stick it in and only give it about 1/2 to 3/4 of a turn and then pull the driver out. That should maintain that this stays tight, plenty tight. If you get it much tighter than that, you're risking breaking it off, and that should hold it plenty well. Make sure that all the screws are tight except, like I said, the motor mount screws, and you're ready to move on to the next step. So let's get moving. After you've verified that all the appropriate screws are tight and your frames are square and everything's been tightened in a cross pattern, it's time to start preparing your landing gear to go on your model. On this side of the page, you'll notice that you will need one pair of landing gear, one 2x14mm socket cap screw, one M2 lock nut, one M2 hex nut, and a piece of fuel tubing. The piece of fuel tubing is a little longer than it will need to be, and we will trim that down later, but we'll leave it the way it is for now. There is a little bit of a trick to putting this together, and we'll get into how to do that later. The tools that you will need is a 1.5mm hand driver, a long pair of long nose pliers, and a 4.5mm box wrench. If you have one, it makes this a lot easier process to go through. So let's get to putting this together, and I'll show you the tricks to make this easy on you. What you're going to do is you're going to thread the plain hex nut about halfway up on your 2x14mm socket cap screw. Take this and thread it through the hole and find the flat spots until the nut seats. Take your lock nut, and usually it's too small for me to mess with. That's where my needle nose pliers comes in. I'll usually take the lock nut and hold it over the top. Take your 1.5mm hand driver and threaded onto the lock nut, holding the lock nut in place. Once you have the lock nut threaded on, usually these are kind of difficult to act as a wrench. That's where my 4.5 millimeter box end wrench comes into play. I'll put this over the nut and just thread it on until the lock nut's good and tight. Now the length of the nut that you're going to be using on the back side here, or actually the length of the socket cap screw, will be determined after you actually mount the canopy. So you can actually get that threaded on there and push that nut back in and then thread it back until the lock nut hits the surface of the landing gear and it will stop. And you can use your box end wrench if you want to tighten it down a little bit more at this point. It's not a problem. But at that point it's pretty much secured. You can put your piece of fuel tubing over this at this time if you want, but what you'll likely find is you'll want to adjust the length of this nut, or actually the length of this socket cap screw, to get just the perfect fit, so when your canopy pops over it, it snaps over it real nice and gives a good positive connection. Let's get on to mounting these to the frames. In step 1-5 plus, you will see that we've gone on ahead and mounted the tail servo plates earlier on in the assembly. Go ahead and leave these loose as they are right now, so let's just go ahead and mount the landing gear to the frames. All you're really going to do is put the landing gear between the frames and use these two holes with these two 2x6 millimeter socket cap screws to mount the landing gear to the frames. There are no screws used in the rear holes at this time, so just ignore those right now. We'll use those later. Let's get this put together and see what it looks like. After you get your landing gear installed, this is exactly what you should have in your hand. Remember not to use Loctite on screws going into plastic, and also be careful not to over tighten your screws going into plastic, because they'll just strip if you keep tightening them down. This is what you should be looking like, so you're starting to look like a helicopter. Let's get on to the next step.